This week on Thinking Deeply About Primary Education.
From one meeting to the next, it felt like there was just another priority to think about in another subject. And I think at primary in particular, there's a lot of noise because there's so many competing subjects that are all kind of vying for time, that can make it really hard to keep the main thing, which is like thinking really deeply about how we can make teachers better. You know, if you do it well, if you have a clear model and a clear structure to follow with instructional coaching, actually it kind of activates all of those EDF mechanisms for you. The whole staff rehearsal can be so powerful because it's a bit of a like buy one, get one free of helping teachers embed new techniques, helping coaches develop confidence in modelling and rehearsal, but underpinning that, like together, coming collaboratively around this, what can be quite uncomfortable to begin with, but breaking down those barriers to rehearsal so that it does lead to impact.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Alex Gingell. How are you, Alex?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's fantastic to have you here. Your talk went down really, really well at TDAPA London, and you are joining us again for TDAPA Manchester. And I thought in between the two, try and sort of pin you down to really explore something that I think lots of teachers should be thinking about.
Great. Yeah, pleasure.
And because it's your first time in the podcast, I thought we'd maybe begin with a little bit about who you are and how you got here today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Alex. I was, up until September last year, I was the head teacher at Headley Park Primary School in Bristol, where I was for the last kind of 4 years. Before that headship, I was a co-head of a school in London where I was formerly the deputy as well for a few years. And before that, I was kind of a teacher in London and a teacher in Bristol. So that's kind of, I guess, my journey towards like where I was last year. And since September, I've been working with Step Lab as a coaching development lead. So I now get the absolute privilege of working with lots of school leaders to help them implement really great professional development programs in their schools. And I'm absolutely loving it. It's very, very different. Having kind of been in schools forever, but really enjoying being able to kind of narrow my focus and really support schools to think deeply about great professional development.
Did you find it difficult to transition to having absolutely no time to being in charge of your time? How was that transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm still transitioning, to be honest. I feel like I'm still sort of finding my feet a little bit. I mean, I think what's really helped is that I work with an amazing team of people. Like the team at Step Lab are just like fully inspirational, and like blow my mind on a daily basis at kind of how thoughtful they are and how deeply they think about what we do. I think that's helped, and I think it's helped that everybody in the team that I work in has also been a teacher and a leader in a school, right? So they kind of understand the complexities and the challenges that we face in schools daily. And that's definitely helped me move from headship into this new role. And like, you know, headship's crazy. Being a teacher is just bonkers for so many reasons, but it's also great. And I do miss working with young people, and I miss the daily interactions with kids because they make it all worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I was thinking, yeah, Step Lab, I mean, some great minds. It must be fantastic whenever you guys all get together and stuff like that there.
Yeah, I mean, our team meetings are, yeah, there's something else. There's some really thought-provoking, like interesting stuff that we discuss. And, one of the reasons that I wanted to work with the team was because they're kind of on the cutting edge of thinking about how you develop great teaching, and I really wanted to be a part of that. And I'm like genuinely super privileged to now be working with them and to be part of those conversations because they are genuinely exciting conversations to be a part of.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's fantastic to have Step Lab on board for the conferences, because it's very much a case everybody's working towards the the same goal, and it's fantastic to have the team support.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think there was no question about it really. We want to support grassroots professional development, and TDAPI's doing a really great job of just bringing people together to think carefully about developing great teaching in the same way that we are at Step Lab. So it kind of makes quite a lot of sense, I think, to be involved.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it definitely does feel like kindred spirits on a level, sort of like you say, working towards making the system better, and donating money to a good cause at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to explore coaching and whole staff rehearsal in particular. But before you embarked on this journey, what was your experience of professional development?
Yeah, I mean, good question. And I was actually reflecting on this with some colleagues recently, but I feel like I've always been drawn to professional development, even from when I was a trainee teacher. I trained at the University of Plymouth, did a 4-year BEd, and while I was there, I worked with a team of other students to set up an education society, and we kind of like brought in speakers and we ran PD events for fellow trainees, and it was like I've realized I've always kind of enjoyed geeking out on professional development and like helping people get better. But I think once I then became a teacher, my experience of professional development was probably similar to that of many others in the profession. I think early in my career, it felt a bit like I was kind of learning mostly through trial and error. Like feedback was there and I received it, but it was maybe a few times a year, usually following some sort of high stakes lesson observation that, to be honest, I would have planned within an inch of its life. And I'd sort of sit down afterwards with a leader and they'd unpack what went well and like what to work on, but no one really, no one like showed me exactly what that improvement looked like in practice. And I remember being told things like, try using more open questions. And then, a few weeks later, it was like, oh, maybe you've asked too many questions at that point. And it was kind of like no one really helped me understand what is the real purpose of asking questions. What is like someone model to me what great questioning looks like, and then I will understand a bit more clearly. So, and that's not to say there weren't brilliant colleagues that I learned a lot from the people that I worked with, but I think I learned more from kind of watching them and seeing them in action, rather than just being told kind of what to do to get better. And like I also was reflecting on this the other day, like professional development meetings weren't really PD meetings. It kind of felt a bit more like they were these like one meeting to the next, it felt like there was just another priority to think about in another subject. And I think at primary in particular, there's a lot of noise because there's so many competing subjects that are all kind of vying for time. It just sort of felt like there was a bit too much going on, to be honest. Whereas actually, I think narrowing that focus and removing some of that probably would have helped me improve more quickly. So yeah, I mean that was my experience of professional development. I think like as a leader, I really wanted to avoid that myself. But I'll be honest, I did find myself falling into some of those same traps around like, creating tick lists of good teaching and kind of expecting that staff would just listen and go away and put that into practice straight away, and then all of a sudden just to be shocked that, oh, it wasn't actually having a massive impact. So I think for me, one of the turning points was when I became a head teacher. And I know I work for Step Lab, so I'm a bit biased, but before I worked for them, I did, you know, follow some of their training, and I enrolled on the first ever certificate in coaching leadership, which is a really, really rigorous course, and it totally changed how I saw professional development. Not just in how like I received it, because it was the first time I'd kind of experienced receiving these mechanisms of great PD, as a learner, but it was also the first time I thought really deeply about, okay, how am I going to activate some of those things in my own planning and delivery of professional development back at school.
I think lots of people will have similar experiences. They may even be experiencing those things right now. And I think these things happen for a reason, and it may be against our best intentions. And, some things just, I always speak to maths leads about how much of a priority mathematics is. And they're saying, well, this year it's a priority. And well, hold on a second. Next year, but obviously that's very easy for me to say that because I only really focus on one subject, whereas they've got what, 11, 13 sometimes. And it's interesting you mentioned being interested in sort of professional development earlier, very early on, because I always felt I was interested in research, but I wasn't necessarily reading the research that I am now, if that makes sense. And it was only people like Carl Hendrick, Tom Sherrington, and stuff sort of signposting things in the early days of Twitter. And I think, oh, actually, there's a whole world out here to really get stuck into. But there maybe it was like 8 years of teaching where I wasn't reading those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of the reason for that is, time. I mean, when you're early on in your career, you just don't have time to engage in stuff because you're sort of fighting to survive in some ways. You learn a lot because you kind of have to and you have to survive, but you don't necessarily have the time to think really deeply about what current research says about best practice. And you have to then go with what people in your school are saying, right? You have to go by the structures that exist in your school around what they're saying makes really good teaching. And I think that's where, when I became a leader, I felt that responsibility. I'm the person who can open these doors for people. I can bring in this research that I've been able to engage with and think deeply about and help them understand what makes great teaching. And that's something that I guess I didn't really have early on in my career. And I did learn a lot from Twitter. I mean, I've been on Twitter for a while. Took a bit of a break when I became a deputy and a head initially because I just again didn't have huge amounts of time. Um, but early on in my career, I remember engaging with people on there, and I learned a lot through the things that people were sharing and discussing, and I got engaged in that discussion online. It was a really great place to be early on, and I think there's some positives still to find in that world at the moment as well.
Yeah, I'm sure there are because in as much the same way that blue sky will have its downsides, there's almost there was that honeymoon period. Any social media requires a big time investment. It's almost like a time investment that I don't have to make. Where, for instance, Chris Such will make it, and he will do his threads, and he will respond to everyone who messages him. But you just got to sort of decide whether or not it's really what you need to prioritize.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it connected me with a lot of people, and I put time into kind of building networks on there. But you're right, to to actually properly engage and reply to people and get stuck in, you do have to give it quite a bit of investment.
Through Step Lab, through engaging sort of meaningfully with your professional development, you've sort of landed on coaching as a vehicle for, I don't know, sort of higher leverage, perhaps is maybe that's not the right phrase, but what is it about coaching that gives it so much potential in the teacher development ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I do love using that word ecosystem when it comes to teacher development because I think it highlights that, PD isn't this like series of one-off events that maybe similar to how I experienced it. It's actually this kind of living, breathing system of super complex but really interconnected parts and things. But I think like one of the challenges around teacher development and getting that ecosystem right is that it's difficult. Like it's difficult to get that right, and that's mainly because like teaching is difficult. It's probably one of the most complex things that a person can do. There's so much going on in a classroom all at the same time. There's so much that can go wrong in any moment. And I think because of that, it's really difficult to then implement changes to our practice. And if we're trying to kind of navigate the complexities of the classroom, but also keep something new in our heads that we're trying to develop, we're trying to improve in our practice, whilst also working out like how do we teach algebra to year six for the first time on a hot morning when like a wasp has just come into the classroom. Do you know what I mean? Like it's tough to do all of those things. So so we develop habits, and to reduce a lot of that load, much of what we do like happens on autopilot, and we don't really think about most of what we do when we're doing it in the classroom. It's quite automatic. But some of those habits are really effective and some of them aren't. And it's really important that we make sure that that autopilot is really strong so that when things are challenging, we can execute something as teachers that's going to be like the highest leverage, the best thing for the students. And so that's like one of the challenges around um, why it's difficult to get teacher development right. And I think the other challenge is that, as we've sort of touched on, leaders are balancing multiple priorities all the time. Teachers are busy, leaders are also busy. Everyone is so busy trying to balance 101 different things in a school that can make it really hard to keep the main thing, which is like thinking really deeply about how we can make teachers better, because that's going to have an outcome. That's going to have a great outcome for our students. So one of the most I think useful resources that came out, that's kind of widely known now, is the EEF's Effective Professional Development Guidance, which outlines those mechanisms that we can have in place in our PD to help build knowledge and keep teachers motivated, develop their practice, and embed those changes kind of over time. But in reality, school leaders are so busy that trying to kind of pull all of those things into practice yourself can be really overwhelming. And I certainly know that, as a head, I had a million and one things going on all at the same time, but I was also responsible for teaching and ensuring that that was really high quality. And I was responsible for everyone's development. So I ran these PD sessions that I kind of thought, oh yeah, that ticks that kind of building knowledge box, and that balance that like manages prior knowledge of the staff. And I'm using credible sources, and I'm giving teachers time to plan for implementation. And we had these discussions early on in those sessions, but this is before coaching, where I was like, God, this is all right. Like, staff are having some really good conversations about these things that we're trying to bring into our practice. I'm sort of building their knowledge. And genuinely, I was a bit like the guy from the pottery throwdown at points. Like, I was welling up. I was like almost crying at how great these conversations were. But then, a couple of weeks later, I'd go into a classroom and I would just see the same thing that we were trying to kind of combat in practice. And I think the key challenge to get right in terms of professional development in your ecosystem is having structures in place that are going to bridge that gap between teachers knowing what a change looks like and actually being able to do it in practice. And like, one of the things that I had missed was getting the balance of those mechanisms right across the PD that I was designing, because it's tough, like, to get it right. And that kind of, for me, is where instructional coaching came in, because, if you do it well, if you have a clear model and a clear structure to follow with instructional coaching, actually it kind of activates all of those EEF mechanisms for you. And that is like, research based, that's a research based approach, an evidence based approach of actually closing that gap between between teachers knowing and doing on the ground. So that was a very long way of me saying that's where instructional coaching kind of came in for our ecosystem.
That's the first time I've heard someone articulate it in that way, because we are trying to ensure that those mechanisms are taken full account of, and almost things like the longevity and the little and often long and thin. That's the bit that I see school leaders struggling with the most. But actually, if you've got a really effective coaching program in place, it takes care of that naturally, doesn't it? So I really like the way you've described that, because for me, it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think though that you do need to find, there needs to be a structure to it, there needs to be a model to it that you follow, and you need like lots of conditions to be in place, a bit like an ecosystem, right? You need the right conditions for coaching to really thrive. But the evidence shows, and there are lots of papers now that are showing that actually, as an approach, it is a highly impactful way of genuinely improving teachers' practice, and therefore student outcomes, if it's in place.
I think we've come a long way in terms of our understanding of professional development and the sort of the things we put in place to allow schools to make the most of it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that the EEF PD guidance is pretty well known now, but that really is a game changer when it comes to actually being a really great resource that genuinely is there to support schools to think carefully about the professional development that they are providing, but give them some really practical things that you need to consider in order to get it right as well. I think that's definitely changed the landscape when it comes to PD hugely in the last few years.
One of the elements that you, I don't know, prioritize, but certainly celebrate and try to, your talk focused on the idea of whole staff rehearsal. And so preface it by saying this is the kind of thing that would make me nervous. Participation in PD gives me nightmares of what is it, icebreakers. And I know that this is not this. But what is whole staff rehearsal? And where does it fit into that wider picture of instructional coaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think whole staff rehearsal was something that we came to at our school after we had launched coaching. I think that's like a key thing to highlight about our journey. Whereas actually now, I would probably suggest that like people get to it first, and perhaps I'll come on to that. But I think like before we unpick kind of what whole staff rehearsal can bring to the PD ecosystem, I think it's really important to highlight that there's a bit of a risk, I think, at the moment that terms like rehearsal and deliberate practice they're in danger of being seen as a bit of a silver bullet for closing that knowing doing gap. And there's a great series of posts by Nick Pointer where he unpacks some of the risks around it, like far more articulately than I can. But one thing that he suggests that you do if you are going to like launch some rehearsal or deliberate practice is that you define it so that you're really clear on what you mean by it. So at my school, like at our school, Headley Park, whole staff rehearsal was a member of the leadership team kind of leading teachers and support staff together through a process of showing a model and deconstructing a model of really effective teaching before we then provided opportunities for them to work with a partner to script, plan, and rehearse that element of teaching and give and receive feedback on it. So they would be doing that for 10 minutes every Wednesday morning from 8:30 to 8:40 before the children arrived. But the principles that make it work, like can be done, can be applied to a longer session or a shorter session. So I know, schools like Reach, where Tilly is the co-head, they do it in 8 minutes, in the morning. But you can do that in a longer session. You can build it into other PD that you provide. But I think the point is that if you do build in opportunities for staff to rehearse together into an ecosystem, a PD system, then you kind of create the conditions for everything else that's part of that ecosystem to work more effectively. So you create the conditions for coaching to work, for feedback to be really strong by prioritizing rehearsal together. And I think that's because, like, as a mechanism of effective PD, and rehearsal is one of those EEF mechanisms, it really helps jumpstart the formation of improved habits outside of the classroom before you go into the classroom. And like that's important because I mean, teaching is a performance profession. I mean, just like moves in sport or surgery, like you can practice and perfect key elements of the profession over time. There is always going to be an optimal action that a teacher can take in any given situation that's going to lead to an improved outcome for students. And if I think about all those times in schools as a teacher and a leader where I think if I'd just done that instead of that, it would have been so much better. Or like if I just said that and not that to that child, we wouldn't be in this situation right now. So those things are things that you can rehearse. And like other professions do that, right? I mean, surgeons don't go straight into surgery, with a live person today. They practice thousands and thousands of times over and over again. Footballers do that off the pitch before they go on the pitch, right? And I think we need to accept that like we are a profession and professionals do rehearse, and teaching is the same as those things. We want to break what we do down into different actions and practice them so we can get better at them and make sure that we do the optimal thing that we can do in a classroom when that moment comes. And I think like by doing that outside of the classroom, you can jumpstart this process of habit formation. And if you rehearse outside, you're more likely to respond in a more effective way when you go back into that context. But like I said, it sort of creates the conditions for everything else because actually it only starts that process of habit formation. You need something to happen after rehearsal in order for that habit to really take root and last and sustain. So to make them stick for the long term, like we need to make sure that there's follow-up PD, like coaching, to make those initial changes that you're sort of kickstarting actually stick for the long term.
The way you describe it sounds a whole lot less intimidating than I perhaps imagined. And again, that you mentioned the use of terminology, and one of those things is people will have prior sort of preconceptions or connotations from prior experiences. If we take the sort of this weekly model with a partner, it could be 8 minutes, could be 10 minutes, could be longer. What sort of what would almost like a 6 week block look like in terms of the things that you focus on with your partner? Are you going to be focused on one thing, get really, really good at it over those 6 weeks, or is it dependent on the person's trajectory and what they want to focus on?
Yeah, good point. I think it's really important to consider not doing too much in a whole staff rehearsal session. And it's crucial to kind of narrow the focus, I think, so that you're able to all be working towards the same thing in those sessions. So there are some limitations to it because you can't like be so personable and like personal with your steps that you're working on improving, and that's kind of where coaching comes in. But whole staff rehearsal is definitely good for having some key like consistencies that you want to establish and embed across your school, and coming together to work on developing those things in your practice as a group of teachers. So, when we started our journey, in terms of our like general school improvement, we had to focus on behaviour. You need to get behaviour right to be able to unlock um, all the other great parts of teaching that you can do. So we focused our whole staff rehearsal on the behaviour strategies that we were trying to establish and embed across the school. And that was a really good way of doing that because we could all come together and work towards that kind of really impactful range of strategies together. I would say very early on, I probably made the mistake of trying to do too much too soon. And I had a great deputy head, Jess Swain, who has since taken over actually as head at the school. And she's launched something called Tweak of the Week, which I think is great. So, like, you launch a strategy, and then over the next couple of weeks, you look at tweaks to the strategy to improve it rather than trying something new, because that can be as overwhelming as, all of those noisy parts of PD that I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that also maybe nods to this idea that we need a sort of shared understanding of great teaching for it to work, but perhaps we'll come on to that.
I mean, I think behavior is a really, really good one because it's one of those ones that anyone listening who had to find out the hard way. If someone gives me a really clear, codified, actionable way to support people behavior, manage people behavior, whatever sort of terminology we want to use, I may still have her, because
Yeah,
my
me
behavior,
too. Me too.
yeah, started 2008. By 2009, it was gone. I was like, well, thanks, teaching. But yeah, but in all seriousness, it can be really tough, and I think it's a really good example. If I'm a teacher and I want to get the most of those 10 minutes, what sort of behaviors am I displaying with my partner? Because I'm thinking, okay, do I let the more experienced teacher guide me, or are there sort of ways to get the most from this rehearsal?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I think what that kind of really talks to is the fact that you need some strong cultural foundations in place first for it to work. So, I said that we didn't start with rehearsal straight away. We came to rehearsal because what I noticed in our coaching conversations from reviewing the data was that it wasn't having as much impact in terms of changing practice as I had hoped. And I kind of looked more deeply at that data and noticed that coaches weren't managing many rounds of rehearsal in their coaching conversations, right? So that mechanism that was supposed to really help teachers apply new knowledge, rehearsal, was actually not leading to impact. And I think one of the things that became really clear was that it was because actually it was adding to people's stress, it was adding to people's cognitive, like strenuous cognitive load, because it was a bit uncomfortable for them in the coaching process. And I kind of realized we hadn't taken the time to lay the groundwork and establish a culture around rehearsal so that it did feel comfortable practicing in front of one another. And I also, I mean, I hadn't also kind of established with the coaching team a real deep understanding of why modeling and rehearsal were so powerful and how to integrate those effectively into feedback as part of coaching. And I think like that's why whole staff rehearsal can be so powerful because it's a bit of a like buy one get one free of helping teachers embed new techniques, helping coaches develop confidence in modeling and rehearsal, but underpinning that like together coming collaboratively around this what can be quite uncomfortable to begin with, but breaking down those barriers to rehearsal so that it does lead to impact in coaching.
I'm actually thinking about times when I've made the mistake on a not an operational level, but on the trying to instigate professional development, and then I've seen where it went wrong, and then next time I'm not going to make that mistake because I know, and it's almost like if the coach knows the purpose and the coachees know the purpose, then everyone's moving and they're asking the right questions, and yeah, so I think that's almost like this is where you need to start is establishing those parameters for everyone, and then from there things start to flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, um, it does take work to get that those conditions in place for sure. And I think you just got to be really as a leader really clear about this is why we're doing it. Like this is why we are rehearsing. This is why we're coming together to do it. You have to, I think, model some vulnerability as well as a leader. So I was the one who was leading those whole staff rehearsal sessions. I was the one as the head stood up doing a live model, and deconstructing what I was doing for the staff to understand um, like what good looked like in that situation. And I think if you are clear with the purpose of the approach and if you are modeling and demonstrating some vulnerability, I think it goes a long way to breaking down barriers and making it just feel more comfortable so that it's like normalizing this thing, normalizing rehearsal um, for everybody. And I think another interesting thing that we did at our school was that Jess, my deputy, and we were the first two people to be coached. So before anybody else received any coaching, I gave myself a teaching commitment of year five RE on a Tuesday afternoon, and Jess came in every week and coached me, and we would film those feedback sessions that Jess was um, delivering to me as another way of just breaking down barriers around people seeing improvement, not as something that's to be feared, but actually something that's to be really embraced. And we used all of those things to really overshare the Dylan William idea, right? That like this is about improving not because we're not good enough, but because we can always be better. And those are the sorts of things that can really help create a culture where people do feel comfortable, stood up, rehearsing in front of everybody. And look, it took time. I mean, it was probably a year before we it truly felt like people are really jumping into this. Um, but it was worth it because of the impact it had for practice, for consistencies that we were trying to embed, um, and for the impact it later had in coaching when we saw improved results through that part of our PD program.
Do you think there are any other benefits that we haven't touched on to utilizing whole staff rehearsal effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like we we have sort of touched on this, but I mentioned the sort of buy one get one free aspect of whole staff rehearsal, and I think what it does is it allows teachers and coaches and leaders to be together developing this shared understanding of what great teaching looks like and a shared language of how to describe it. And when that happens, kind of before teachers go back into their classrooms and before people are giving each other feedback and before coaches are coaching, like everyone's got this shared under the shared mental model of the things that we're trying to do to improve our practice. And I think that is really important because for other parts of your PD to work, like coaching, you need people to be able to diagnose learning problems in classrooms really accurately. And you need people to be able to give precise, genuinely actionable feedback that's going to help you move on. And I think whole staff rehearsal lays the foundations for that. And, we use a bit of an analogy at Step Lab, and it came from Josh Goodrich and some sessions that he was running. But it's a bit like laying railway tracks. So whole staff rehearsal really prepares the ground for other things like coaching. Group rehearsal is like laying the tracks, and if you introduce key techniques there, you build that shared understanding, you sort of smooth the path for people to improve. And then if you sort of put coaching in as well, it's the train that runs on that track and it continues that work that you start in rehearsal so that you're able to really refine practice and embed it over time. But if you don't lay the tracks properly, the train's got nowhere to go. I did take this analogy like slightly further, and I don't know if it works, but I also feel like if you build rehearsal into other parts of the professional development ecosystem, right? So like if you can build it into I don't know, line management meetings or phase meetings or curriculum meetings, planning time, if you can build rehearsal into like all the different aspects of your PD program, it's a bit like, and bear with me, it's a bit like you're building tracks for a high-speed Japanese bullet train, right? Because everything else then can move like much faster. Teacher development is much smoother, and I think the impact that you can have is greater. And like we even got to the point at our school where we built rehearsal into leadership team meetings. So we would, as part of our agenda, have modeling and rehearsal on the agenda, and we would be looking at leadership actions and leadership behaviors and leadership techniques that we wanted to establish and embed across our leadership team. We'd be modeling them, we'd be rehearsing them. It just kind of became part of the fabric of the school. And I think when you do that, it makes your whole like PD program, your whole ecosystem just like supercharged in a really fantastic way.
Whenever you said you were going to take it to the next level, I immediately thought, well, what's the pinnacle of train? And it had to be the Japanese system.
Well, there we go. Yeah.
So I
I
think
didn't. I mean, I didn't get Josh's permission to take it to that level, so I hope that I'm not going to be told off.
no, I can't imagine you will. I mean, it's a rare, well constructed metaphor in education because we don't see them very often. But it was a pleasure to listen to because I felt like I understood better. I was actually incidentally watching. Sometimes you watch those shorts videos, and they were talking about how Japanese trains when we were first introduced the real high speed ones, they would make a noise as they came out of tunnels because the air would be pressed at such high speed through. Now I haven't source fact checked this, but that's why they've got the bill shaped noses
Okay, yeah.
because they looked at animals going through water, possibly a kingfisher, and that was almost like the most aerodynamic thing. So maybe the metaphor evolves towards that, but it needs some source checking.
Well, I mean, look, I'll give you something else to source check because there's another Japanese. There was a research paper that looked at the power of like codification, and Peps McRae talks about this quite a lot, and that they looked at like how the Japanese codified technical engineering or something at one point in the past, and that's why they became this really big like economic superpower because of them codifying what they were doing. And I think that's a really nice bridge into like education. And when you think about codifying great teaching, it turns that abstract into the concrete, into something really specific and actionable. And that really helps people develop and progress. So yeah, I think we can learn a lot from these like analogies about different things that have that have happened in the past and the research around, you know, these great achievements that people have had kind of in other areas of life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was quite like reading books about business and how people have overcome different challenges, that kind of thing. I mean, some of them are specifically, here's how this might pertain to education, but sometimes, there's reading beyond your field is definitely really useful. And like you say, it goes back to when we're in these coaching sessions, can we have meaningful conversations where everyone's actually speaking about what everyone thinks they're speaking about? So
Yeah.
it makes total sense. Are there any potential pitfalls to try and avoid?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like there are things that are going to go wrong if you don't think carefully about how you are going to set rehearsal up. So, we talked a little bit about the strong foundations that you need to have in place in terms of culture, particularly like culture is key. If staff don't feel comfortable sharing their practice, rehearsal's going to feel intimidating. It's not going to feel developmental. So I think you need to make sure that you do a piece of work culturally that ensures that staff genuinely welcome opportunities to improve and that they're not kind of threatened by those. So, we had to do a lot of work at our school around removing some high stakes lesson observation and separating performance management from professional development and introducing more like lower stakes learning walks to sort of build this open door culture and normalize sharing practice. And that really helped create the psychological safety that was needed for rehearsal to really thrive. And I think without that in place, it's a real risk, because it's actually not going to show teachers the value of it. It's not going to land well. It's not going to gain traction. So I think that's certainly something that you need to work on before you launch, is how you get that foundation right. Similarly, I think doing whole staff rehearsal without some sort of shared language of great teaching is not going to lead to the kind of improvement that you can see. You need a common understanding of great teaching and not just kind of isolated techniques, because otherwise you're just going to see this sort of speed camera behavior, right? Where people are just doing it when you walk into their classroom because you've said it's a good thing. You kind of need to consider how you're building a PD curriculum that kind of builds progressively over time, where there are sort of things that are interconnected as part of it. And I think we do kind of need to think about that shared language of teaching as a PD curriculum. And we almost need to think of it as we do subject curriculum. So like there needs to be real clarity about what we want teachers to know and be able to do. We want to focus and strip back some of the distractions so that we can really hone in on the most important high leverage things that are going to lead to student outcomes improving. I think there needs to be coherence. I think it needs to be connected. There needs to be connections between the things that we are working on improving. Um, and there needs to be progression, right? It needs to kind of build over time and be responsive in a way to the different staff that you have got. ECTs might need a different shared language of teaching, a different PD curriculum from more experienced staff. But I think you have to work to get that shared language in place so that it feels really purposeful rather than performative, I guess, right? So like your rehearsal sessions really are explicitly purposeful and linked to that shared language. I guess like there are two key things for me that are proper pitfalls, and they're also just really annoying. I think that I see sometimes. The first is this is not Amdram, like this isn't amateur dramatics, right? This is not acting. This isn't us pretending to be teachers, right? We are teachers. We are refining techniques that are actually going to make a difference for our students on the ground in our classrooms. I think so. We have to position it really professionally. Like this is about honing those strategies. It's about like doing stuff that the evidence says is the best thing to do for improving student outcomes. This is just like other professionals, really normalizing just getting better. And I think if you position it that way rather than, in a sort of dramatized Amdram way, you can make sure it feels like real professional learning rather than this kind of awkward drama exercise. My second bugbear, I guess, is when people apologize for it. And that's a real pitfall because if you launch rehearsal and you're like, right, guys, time for rehearsal, really sorry about this, it totally undermines the value of the mechanism of rehearsal. It signals that like you're a bit uncomfortable with it. It's going to add to people's feelings of resistance or discomfort. And it's going to suggest that this is something that we just need to get through rather than something that we need to embrace. So I actually think people really need to jump into rehearsal with confidence. Like, be unapologetic. This is a core part of professional learning. And if you set the tone in that way, and sort of demonstrate your belief in it as a leader, then other staff are hopefully going to also kind of feel those things as well. So I think it's about really owning it rather than apologizing for it.
Yeah, especially as everyone will be feeding from your energy. And if you, and, and I think it goes for many things. If you are being apologetic, then you haven't really set the scene where this is something worth investing your time in. I think you're absolutely spot on with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, it is a time investment. For this to work properly, you are going to need to do it, regularly. You're going to need to come back to building rehearsal into other parts of your PD program. You're going to have to really commit to it. And if every time you get to it, you're not feeling confident in this approach, it's just going to be a bit miserable for you and really difficult for other people.
It feels like the pitfalls generally are, if you don't do the legwork, you don't put the systems in place, then you can expect your sandcastle to crumble, kind of thing. I'm trying to use mixed analogies, which is what normally happens in education. But essentially, yeah, do the groundwork and things will be all right. If listeners remembered one thing and took away one thing from this episode, and you could choose that one thing, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't feel like I've been particularly joyful about rehearsal, but actually, I hope my enthusiasm for it is coming across because genuinely, I think if there's one thing that people should take away, it's that there's something incredibly energizing about being part of a team who are working together, supporting each other, and getting better together. Like there is a real joy factor for me in that, and staff rehearsal really does do that. So genuinely some of my favorite moments, and my team would probably laugh at me because they know that I used to love it. But like I used to love coming together on a Wednesday morning. It felt really buzzy. We'd start the day rehearsing together, refining the things that we were working on in our practice. It was fun and people were laughing, at different points, but we knew that we were all there to get better for the benefit of our students. And when you do it right, it genuinely is one of the most kind of powerful, rewarding, and enjoyable ways of developing great teaching. So the joy factor would definitely be the one thing I think to take away from this chat. Yes, lay the groundwork, think about your structures, get your systems in place, but enjoy it because like it genuinely can be really fun, um, and yet really impactful at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, joy manifests differently at 7, 8 o'clock on a Monday night than it does
Yeah,
at like 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon.
sure.
But I think what you've done is give us a really clear understanding of why this is something worth investing our time in. And if you think about like anything worth doing is difficult, and there are very few better feelings than whenever you feel you've gotten good at teaching or reasonably good. You've never cracked it. And so the fact that this can contribute to that feeling one day, I think is huge because like you say, it's a really complex set of domains, and to get anywhere near competent is a massive achievement. So that with that on the horizon, I think that's absolutely something to be joyous about.
Agreed, agreed. Particularly when the landscape is challenging at the best of times at the moment, and there's people aren't joining the profession, and we want them to, and we want people to feel that they're getting better because that's going to motivate them to want to remain in the profession. So we've got to think really hard about how we enable that to happen in a really buzzy, like collaborative, joyful way. And I think rehearsal does that.
Listeners can see, they can hear you speak about this again in Manchester, can't they?
Yeah. So in Manchester, like the same thing that I did in London, a couple of tweaks, but I'm going to run a live whole staff, like whole group rehearsal session. So what was great last time in London was that people jumped into it. They were super enthusiastic. So thanks if you did come to that because you made it a really effective session. And I will run through the model that I ran through with my team, and we will sort of jump into some actual rehearsal so that people can really feel how it can be. So yeah, come along to my session and jump in.
Had the pleasure of looking at the slides afterwards, and nobody really scratched the surface on what was there. So well worth going to that. I mean, if anyone's listening and they're thinking about going to Manchester, well, by the time this episode comes out, they've got about 6 hours to get tickets. So off you go. Hurry up, guys.
It might be a little bit too late, perhaps, for some people.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised. I was getting emails in the final week, and I was like, "I've done the food order. What am I going to do?"
Yeah.
It was okay. There was plenty of it.
But I mean, listen, hey, the food in London was absolutely superb, by the way. So that was amazing. But just like a little plug as well, we do have the Step Lab documentary, and episode 4 does have some clips from a whole staff rehearsal session at Reach Academy Feltham. So if you can't make it to Manchester, but you want to see what it can look like, have a little look at that episode on steplab.co/watch and you can see what it looks like in action there.
Nice. I'll add that to the show notes so that people can click on that directly.
Great.
I mean, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I think only really, like I say, only scratching the surface of what could be a really powerful tool at our disposal. All I said to just say thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.